Hi everybody, welcome back to class. I hope you're doing really well. You saw the title for this lecture on Moodle is Our Home and Native Land, and that's what we're dedicating this week to, is looking at the history of politics in Canada as it intersects with the First Peoples on this territory. So in other words, we're going to be looking at the history of the most important political moments and political documents that relate to Aboriginal rights and form some of Aboriginal rights in Canada. Now, I must say that there is a little bit of discomfort for me when I talk about, for instance, Aboriginal rights, because I'm not Aboriginal. I do actually have an undergraduate degree in Native Studies, but I am quite comfortable in discussing these moments that shaped relationships between First Nations and the Government of Canada. Now, if you're interested in learning more about things like spirituality, Native spirituality, powwow culture, etc., there's all kinds of interesting courses at Cambrian you can take, but we're going to stick to that political domain today. So before we get started, pause this recording and please reflect on the question of the week before you dig into the lecture. And so once you're done that, we'll keep going. Not very many people know that the first evidence of a democratic system that we are aware of was actually found within First Nations. You may have heard of them as the Six Nations. If you are French in background, you may know of them as the Iroquois Confederacy. They call themselves the Haudenosaunee, a group of 6 different populations or 6 different tribes of Native people who would come together and discuss matters of import in a longhouse and come to solutions together about how to best manage their concerns, how to best manage the land, etc. And it is a documented fact that people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were quite impressed. In fact, the word is typically inspired by what they saw the Haudenosaunee doing. And when they created the Constitution of the United States, they were informed by this practice that so impressed them. I want to take us back to first contact. So when I say first contact, I would think if your education in elementary and high school looked anything like my education in elementary and high school, you learned that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and he arrived at this land, and he didn't know what it was, but he figured he was in India, so he just called the people who lived there Indians. And when he discovered he was not in India, he just kept calling them Indians. Well, I want to complicate that story a little bit. So when we talk about first contact, and I'm just going to refer to the areas that we now know as Canada, we had essentially the French explorers and the British explorers who came. And they saw these lands, and they saw the abundant forests filled with wildlife, and they said to themselves, we can make a fortune back in Europe if we can get some of these furs over there. So what did they do? They created relationships with the First Nations groups who were A, adept hunters, B, able to manage the very difficult terrain to get further into trade routes to get access to more things like more beaver pelts and more furs. So they create these relationships, the French with certain groups of First Nations, the British with other groups of First Nations. Now, this is a very lucrative relationship on both sides because the French and the British are able to get access to furs, which they can sell in Europe, but also the First Nations are able to get access to things they've never necessarily had before. Things like, metal utensils, tools, guns especially. So this is a lucrative relationship on both sides, and that's an important point to stop on because we're not talking about one group being dominant over another and saying, you must do this for us because we are in charge. We're talking about bilateral relationships. Just like when Canada does a trade deal with Mexico, it's two countries coming to a table and equally deciding on a deal. That's what first contact looked like. So they created these relationships, the French with certain groups, the British with other groups. However, this was, as I mentioned, a lucrative deal. And so what we started to see was First Nations warfaring with each other to gain control of more territory so that they could have access to more of those pelts and more of those furs. Now we know that in the early 1700s, there was something called the Great Peace that was established. And basically, we saw groups saying, okay, you know, we can't be doing this warfaring anymore. We need to make a deal. So the deal is going to be that we're going to share all this land like a dish with two spoons. And again, it speaks to that bilateral, that equal relationship, because one spoon is not more powerful or bigger or smaller than the other spoon. The idea is that the land is a bowl and the spoons are the parties involved in this situation. Of course, we saw the British take dominance over what would become the Dominion of Canada, and the first political institution that we saw established related to First Nations was the British Indian Department in 1755. And this department was designed specifically to keep and to create good relations with First Nations and to deal with any conflicts that might arise that could disrupt this very lucrative trade deal that they had established together. Shortly after this time, after the creation of the British Indian Department, we see a significant shift on the side of the British in how they view or frame their relationship with the First Nations. And that shift comes in the form of this document, the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because if you'll think back to my lecture on the Constitution, I talked about how there are many documents that make up the Constitution. And I mentioned that one of those documents is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So I'm going to read for you this passage that we have here, and then we're going to unpack it. And whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest and the security of our colonies that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominion or territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. So what this is saying is, well, it's saying a few things. First of all, good relations with the First Nations are essential to their interests and to the security of their colonies. Second of all, and I'm going to jump down to the bottom here, there is a very important acknowledgement, and I should say the Royal Proclamation is a decree of the Queen. So what the Queen is saying at the end of this passage here is that land has not been purchased by Britain, and therefore it still belongs to the First Nations. So what she's saying, what the Queen is saying, is that unless the British buy the land off of the First Nations, there's an acknowledgement that the First Nations actually own the land. And that forms the basis of many of the legal arguments that will come in the future. But also, and finally, I want to point out the passage where she says that the First Nations live under our protection, live under the protection of the Queen. So this is a shift in relationships between Aboriginals and the European settlers, because rather than saying we are equal parties at the table, what the Queen is now saying is we're responsible to take care of these people, or these people are wards of the state. So that's a very significant shift. Now to 1867. I hope that date sounds familiar because that is the birth of Canada, with the British North America Act of 1867. So what we see here very much echoes what we see in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where some of those ideas that the Queen set out about the relationship between the Dominion and the Aboriginal peoples are echoed in this document, particularly in section 9124, where it says that the federal government has the legislative jurisdiction for, quote, Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So what does that mean? Again, a repeat of two ideas. First of all, that the federal government is responsible for taking care of the First Nations. So again, a departure from that two equal parties relationship and to a one group having more power and taking care of another group. Second of all, we see a repeat of that idea that there are lands reserved for Indians, therefore that the First Nations people who live on those lands actually own those lands until they are purchased by the Dominion. And that's where we see the creation of something called the Numbered Treaties. So this took place between 1871 and 1921. And you can see on this map that I've laid out here where those treaties started. So in Lower Manitoba and reaching all the way up east and north as we go throughout the years. And those treaties, so we had basically the British Canadian government set out people to make deals with the First Nations that they thought owned those lands in order to buy those lands off those First Nations. So those deals, particularly the first deals, had a lot less in them than the later deals did. So we saw word spreading across the land that that the chiefs would need to negotiate harder because they were seeing unfolding a relationship that they didn't think they had signed up for. So before I describe these treaties, I'd like to talk about the two perspectives that these groups were going into it with. So folks who came from a European context had a sense of ownership, right? You buy a piece of land, you build a house on it, that's your property. Whereas typically First Nations had more of a stewardship relationship to the land. So I don't actually own this land, I live on this land, I benefit from this land, and I try to take care of this land. So first of all, the notion that the land could be sold, that wasn't a concept that was very well understood by the First Nations who are entering into these negotiations. So at first we see in the deals things like you'll give us a little bit of money every year, maybe some farming tools. We see education as one of the elements that comes out in the treaties, even healthcare as the treaties go on, as people become a little bit more, chiefs become a little bit more savvy about these negotiations. So what you'll see here is the numbered treaties are all the areas that the Canadian negotiators went and purchased the land, and we call those the numbered treaties. Now, what's very interesting about this picture is that, as you can see, there are a whole lot of places that were not bought in numbered treaties. And by the logic of the British North America Act, and which is backed up by the Royal Proclamation, that would mean that all those lands that were not purchased were still, in fact, owned by First Nations people. Shortly after the establishment of Canada, the government decided that it needed to deal with the quote-unquote Indian problem. In other words, the idea was that rather than having separate rules and separate areas governing relationships between the First Nations and the settlers, the colonial settlers, they decided that what they needed to do was to create one place, one department called the Department of Indian Affairs that would manage those relations and centralize the management of those relations. So there was a law passed called the Indian Act, and basically it was a consolidation of a whole big bunch of laws that existed in different places on how Aboriginal people were expected to behave, where they could go, what requirements there would be for them. So those laws ranged from everything from making potlucks and Sundance ceremonies illegal to requiring people who lived on reserve to receive permits if they were to leave the reserve. So it was a whole big mishmash of laws that fell under this Indian Act, and it was amended many, many times over the years of its existence. Of course, this document has long been seen as a racist document, and there have been governments in the not so recent history that have tried to get rid of the Indian Act altogether. In fact, the first Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's government, decided that it was going to, in 1969, abolish the Indian Act. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because while this document was harmful in many ways to First Nations, it was also a place that recognized certain rights that were allotted to First Nations. And so First Nations across the country, when the earlier Trudeau government decided it was going to repeal this legislation, stood up and said, no, don't get rid of it. They didn't say that because it was a good act. They said that because, well, first of all, they hadn't been consulted on removing the act, and second of all, there was no transition plan or no transition plan that was good enough to move away from the Indian Act and still protect some of the rights that were within that act. One of the most potent, I think we could say, civilizing tools were the schools that were set up by the government. John A. Macdonald laid out a policy where he said one of the main tools for civilizing or making Native people just like regular Canadians would be the school system. So two types of schools were developed. There were on-reserve day schools, but the the schools you've probably heard of were the residential schools that were off reserve, and children would be gathered up from communities and taken to these schools throughout the school year and then sent home during the summer. The government left these schools by and large to be run by religious groups, and the primary goal of these, beyond teaching basic reading, writing, arithmetic, was to teach these children how to behave like and speak the language of average Canadians. So in other words, the goal was assimilation. And you may be familiar with the incredibly damaging legacy of particularly the residential school system. And that was highlighted in a recent Canadian Heritage commercial, which described the story of one child's experience in trying to escape his residential school. And I'll play that for you now. Just a little warning, it is a bit disturbing.
Johnny wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away. They forced him to go to the Indian residential school. More than 150,000 of us children had to go. They wanted to change us.
Our Father in heaven,
hallowed be your name.
Hallowed be your name.
Thy kingdom come,
Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done.
Thy will be done.
Kill the Indian and the child. It's been called cultural genocide. I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
Shawnee Wenjack was one of thousands of children who died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy today.
Despite the fact that these schools have been around since Canada became Canada, it took until 1998 for the Canadian government to apologize for what happened to these children. And that apology was delivered by a conservative prime minister named Stephen Harper. Along with that apology, there was a promise to give some financial compensation to the survivors who endured abuse in the residential schools. But also there was the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was charged with coming up with a report on how to rectify this situation and how to make amends for the legacy of residential schools. And that report was released quite recently. In 2016, I believe, and it came out with almost 100 recommendations. And those recommendations included all manner of things, from dealing with making sure that when Aboriginal children are removed from their homes, they're not removed from their communities, to providing better education to people in schools. And we're seeing an example of that at Cambrian College. In fact, Cambrian is the only college in the entire province that's a signatory to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what that means is that we take our responsibility seriously to educate people about that history and to make sure that those stories are not forgotten, that those stories are taught, and that we honor First Nations cultures going forward. So hopefully we will see progress being made, and we will, see the government make strides to reconcile for this terrible part of our past. Now, although Pierre Elliott Trudeau was not successful in getting rid of the Indian Act, he was successful in patriating the Constitution. So, in other words, he was able to bring the Constitution home to Canada. And as you know, that was in 1982 when he, along with the provinces, passed the Constitution Act. The Constitution Act, of course, one of the most important constitutional documents, again reinforced some of the rights that we've seen reflected in other constitutional documents. So here are a few passages pertaining to Aboriginal rights. First of all, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal people are hereby recognized and affirmed. What that means is those numbered treaties are considered valid treaties. Number 2, in this act, Aboriginal people of Canada includes Indian, Inuit, and Métis people from across Canada. This was a shift because it was ambiguous whether or not the Métis and the Inuit would also be wards of the state or taken care of by the state. But this was a clarifying document that brought those people into the fold. Number 3, for greater certainty, treaty rights include rights that now exist by way of land claim agreements or may so be acquired. So remember how I showed you that map and how that map showed that the treaties did not extend across the whole country. What this section is saying is that those numbered treaties will be protected, but so will newer treaties as they attempt to create treaties for the rest of the land that has yet to be claimed. And finally, notwithstanding any other provision of this Act, the Aboriginal and treaty rights referred to in subsection 1 are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. And this sounds like it would be an obvious statement, but historically speaking, it certainly was not. Aboriginal female advocates fought hard for that line in the Constitution. And that's because before this Constitution and before 1985 and the passing of Bill C-31, Aboriginal women who married non-Aboriginal men lost their status. Once they married those men, they became no longer Aboriginal. So after the passing of Bill C-31 in 1985, I believe it was over 60,000 women regained their status as Aboriginal people. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, the earliest relationship between the explorers or the settlers and the First Nations people seemed to be one of equals, of two equal parties coming to the table and creating mutually beneficial deals. That relationship degraded throughout the years as we saw the state take power over First Nations people, tell First Nations people how they should be and where they could go. I think that particularly since the hard work of a lot of First Nations advocates, but also since the Constitution Act of 1982, we have been seeing a reimagining of that relationship and a recognition of the inherent rights of First Nations people, not because they were given those rights by the government, but because they always existed. So one of those was the recognition that lands that were not sold in treaties, in fact, still belong to the First Nations. And as you might remember, looking at this map, that whole area that is now Nunavut had not been sold off in a treaty. There was an extensive and successful comprehensive land claim process that resulted in that land in 1999 being called Nunavut and becoming the land of the Inuit, governed by the Inuit. So that has been probably one of the greatest success stories of the establishment of self-government. Now, other land claims are being negotiated in various areas. In some cases, they're comprehensive land claims, and what that means is that the land was never sold, so the land needs to be bought by the Canadian government. In some cases, they're specific land claims. And remember when I said that the colonizers or the Canadian officials were dealing with the chiefs that they thought owned the land? Well, sometimes there'd be several communities that were in the same area, and the Canadian officials might have dealt with one of the populations, but not with other populations. So in the specific land claims, we're seeing those issues being teased out and sorted out, and redress being, made in cases where certain populations were not dealt with, right? So a couple of really positive moves forward. We've also seen the federal government attempt to address and fix those relations by changing the name of the department responsible for dealing with First Nations people. So for the longest time it was called the Department of Indian Affairs, reflecting that Christopher Columbus mistake. But finally, in the 90s, the Conservative government renamed the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. The Trudeau government, the Justin Trudeau government, has since changed that department and turned it into two departments, one for dealing with matters related to things like treaties called Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, and the other to work with people on matters ranging from education to clean drinking water, etc. And that department is called Indigenous Services. So some movement there. More impactfully, what we've also seen is Aboriginal people speaking for themselves in much greater numbers and in much louder voices. One of the main critiques of Aboriginal groups when things like these name changes occur, or when governments consider doing away with, the Indian Act, is that there is not enough consultation of and with Aboriginal people. And there's a desire to return to that bilateral relationship that existed at first contact. A few years ago, we saw the birth of a very powerful movement called Idle No More. And Idle No More was a trans-Indigenous movement that sought to unite Indigenous people together, whether it's in Canada or in the United States or all over the world, that seeks to unite Aboriginal people together to argue for issues of common concern. And where their voices seem to have been most powerful is on matters related to the environment. So Aboriginal people speaking up against certain developments that would harm their lands, and the lands that they still, many Aboriginal people still see themselves to be stewards over. So that has also been a very promising change in the relationship between the government and Aboriginal people. Given what I've just said, I think it's fitting to not end this lecture with my voice, but with the voice of a very successful, young, and prominent Aboriginal person within Canada. You might know him. His name is Wab Kinew. He is currently the leader of the Manitoba NDP, but he's been, and surely over the next years will continue to be, one of the leaders in pushing for justice for Aboriginal people in this country. So I'll let Wab Kinew take it away. Don't forget the reading guide questions are at the end of the PowerPoint, and have yourselves a great day.
Hey Canada, I'm Wab Kinew. I know I'm not your boyfriend, but wouldn't mind being your man on the side. But for this thing to work, there's 5 things you're going to have to stop saying about my people. First thing, alcohol. The big thing that separates us here isn't the alcohol, it's the poverty. Because when a non-native person passes out, they do it at a curling club or at a Nickelback concert. But when a native person does, they do it on the street, which is shameful, but also comfortable. Then there's this whole idea of get over it. You know, why don't you guys just get over it? You know what? I am over it. My dad was raped in a residential school by a nun. I'm over it. But it doesn't mean that we should forget it. Then there's the long hair thing. You know, some Aboriginal people do wear their hair long as a symbol of cultural pride. Those are the natives with beautiful, long, straight hair. For curly-haired Ojibwe such as myself, hair clippers have been the greatest invention of the white man since the mirror. Then, I often hear this question. What are you guys doing with the $7 billion? $7 billion we give Indian Affairs, what are you guys doing with it? You know what? That money has to pay for a population the same size as New Brunswick. You know what New Brunswick spends on their population? $8 billion. And yet I never hear Canadians ask, hey, New Brunswick, what are you doing with your $8 billion? Finally, one of your favorites, taxes. Guess what? I'm a status Indian. I pay income tax. I pay sales tax. I once even paid a land transfer tax. Ironic. It's all part of a much larger stereotype that Aboriginal people in Canada are getting a free ride. 140 years after the treaties, we're still waiting for the things that we were promised in those agreements to share the land. So I ask you, who's really getting the free ride?